He did not descend from the sky into a vacuum. That sentence alone dismantles one of the most persistent misunderstandings about Jesus of Nazareth. The quiet, floating figure of stained glass and devotional paintings, suspended somewhere between earth and eternity, untouched by the grit of the world around him. That image, however beautiful, is not the man recorded in the Gospels. The man recorded in the Gospels smelled like sawdust and animal dung. He knew what blisters felt like. He understood from childhood what it meant to be thirsty in the dry season, to sleep on a packed earth floor, to eat the same rough bread 3 times a day for weeks at a stretch. But here is the question almost no one thinks to ask. What did his world actually look like? Not the world of church paintings and cathedral ceilings, the real world. The tactile, smelling, noisy, exhausting, deeply human world of first-century Judea. What did his neighbors hear when they woke up before dawn? What did a family in Galilee actually own? What were the sounds of a village street at the 6th hour, when the sun was at its most brutal? What made people afraid? What made them laugh? What killed them quietly and slowly? And what killed them fast? Because here is the thing, and this is the reason this matters so deeply. If you do not understand the world Jesus lived in, you cannot fully understand what he said. His parables were not invented in a study. His metaphors were not pulled from a library. They were drawn directly from the streets, the fields, the kitchens, the markets, the dusty roads and the limestone wells of a specific time and a specific place. Every word he spoke made immediate visceral sense to the people who first heard it, because they were living inside the imagery he used. Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels. And, for many people, it changes everything. If you were born in first-century Judea, your world would be defined, before anything else, by stone and dust. The landscape was not gentle. The hill country of Galilee, where Jesus spent the vast majority of his life, was a terrain of rocky slopes, shallow topsoil, terraced fields cut laboriously into hillsides by generations of farmers, and valleys that flooded in winter and baked to cracked clay in summer. The Jordan River ran through a deep rift to the east. The Mediterranean coast was a different world, a Hellenized world of ports and merchants and Roman commercial culture, close in distance but enormously distant in spirit from the Galilean villages perched in the hills above. Nazareth, the village where Jesus grew up, was small. Estimates place its population at somewhere between 200 and 400 people. That means it was not a town in any modern sense. It was a cluster of households, almost entirely Jewish, built from local limestone, set into a hillside, surrounded by agricultural land that the families of the village worked with their hands and their animals, season after season, generation after generation. The houses themselves were not the whitewashed, spacious structures sometimes depicted in film. They were low, thick-walled, dimly lit. The walls were built from roughly cut limestone blocks, sometimes mortared with mud, sometimes dry stacked. The roofs were made of wooden beams, expensive, precious wood, laid across the walls and covered with packed earth and clay, sometimes reinforced with branches or thatch. Those roofs were not stable. They required regular maintenance. After heavy winter rains, they leaked. After dry summers, they cracked. A family's roof was not a given. It was an ongoing responsibility. The floors of most homes were packed earth, sometimes plastered. Furniture was minimal. A stone hand mill for grinding grain, clay storage jars, oil lamps made of fired clay with a single wick floating in olive oil, woven mats for sleeping, a small hearth or portable brazier for cooking. That was, for most families, essentially everything. Wealth was measured not in possessions but in land, in animals, in the quality of your cistern, and in the size of your grain store. If you are already beginning to revise the image in your mind, good, because this matters enormously. If those who follow this channel and come back week after week to walk through the world of first-century Judea find value in these journeys, consider subscribing. Not because it helps an algorithm, but because this kind of historical reconstruction takes time, care, and commitment. And knowing that it reaches people makes it worth continuing. The day in a Galilean village began before the sun rose. Not metaphorically, literally before dawn, because the work demanded it. Women were typically the first awake, rising in the darkness to restart the fire, using stored embers from the night before, covered in ash to keep them alive, and to begin the grinding. Grain was not stored as flour. It was stored as whole grain. Wheat, barley, lentils. Every morning, the amount needed for the day's bread had to be ground fresh on the hand mill, a circular saddle quern or rotary mill made of basalt, a volcanic stone imported from the region northeast of Galilee, precisely because its rough, abrasive surface was ideal for grinding. The sound of grinding grain was the sound of morning. Travelers and traders who passed through villages before dawn described the rhythmic sound of millstones as the first sign of a settlement nearby. It was, in that world, as reliable as birdsong. The book of Jeremiah would use the silencing of that sound as a metaphor for total desolation. The voice of the millstone gone meant a city was dead. That is not poetic embellishment. It was a concrete, immediately recognizable image to every person who heard it. The grinding took time, real time, enough grain for a family of 5 or 6, enough to make the day's flatbread, required perhaps an hour of continuous grinding, sometimes more. It was done by hand, on the floor, by women who knew the weight of that stone in their palms the way a modern person knows the weight of their phone. It was not romantic. It was hard, repetitive labor that began before the sky turned gray and continued until there was enough flour to feed the household through the day. This detail, so small it might seem trivial, is in fact a key that unlocks something. When Jesus speaks of 2 women grinding at the mill, one taken, one left, he is not reaching for an exotic image. He is pointing at the most ordinary, intimate moment of everyday female life, something every woman in his audience recognized in her body. The parable was not an abstraction. It was a kitchen. It was their hands. Water was not a convenience. It was a calculation. In first-century Galilee, every family understood, with the kind of clarity that only scarcity produces, exactly how much water they had, where it came from, how long it would last, and what would happen if it ran out. This was not anxiety. It was simply the framework of daily existence, the way people in colder climates track firewood, or the way sailors track wind. Water was the first variable in every decision about food, livestock, hygiene, and survival. It shaped the placement of villages, the design of houses, the structure of the agricultural calendar, and the social architecture of community life. Most Galilean villages were built near natural springs or above underground water sources that could be reached by cutting cisterns into the limestone bedrock. A cistern was not a luxury. It was the most important piece of infrastructure a household could possess. Families cut them by hand into the rock beneath their homes or in their courtyards, plastered them with hydraulic lime to prevent seepage, and filled them during the rainy season, roughly October through April, to survive the long, dry months that followed. A good cistern, well plastered and well covered, could preserve water for most of the dry season. A cracked cistern was a slow disaster. The prophet Jeremiah used exactly that image. a broken cistern that cannot hold water, as his metaphor for a people who had abandoned the source of life. His audience understood immediately. They had seen cracked cisterns. They had felt what it meant to reach in and find less water than expected. Public wells and springs were the other axis around which water life turned. The walk to the well was not incidental to daily life. It was daily life. Women typically made this journey at least once a day, often twice, carrying clay or stone jars on their heads or balanced against their hips, jars that when full of water weighed between 15 and 25 kilograms. The well was a gathering point, a place of social exchange, a location where news traveled, where relationships were negotiated, where the social order of the village was visible and readable to anyone with eyes to see it. The timing of the walk mattered. The customary hour for women to draw water was in the cool of the evening, a practical decision, since carrying heavy loads in the midday heat of a Palestinian summer was punishing. This makes a specific detail in the Gospel of John suddenly sharp with meaning. When Jesus speaks to the Samaritan woman at the well in the 4th chapter of John, it is the 6th hour, the middle of the day. She is there at the wrong time. No other women are present. The well is empty of the social activity that normally defined it. She has come alone, in the heat, specifically because she does not want to be seen. The text does not explain this. It does not need to. Any first-century reader would have understood immediately. She was avoiding something. She was carrying something heavier than a water jar. The agricultural calendar was the clock by which life ran. There was no separation in the Galilean village between the rhythms of the land and the rhythms of human existence. The two were the same thing. The year moved in a pattern that every family knew by body. The early rains in October that softened the baked summer soil enough to plow, the plowing and sowing that followed immediately, because to delay was to lose the season, the slow green growth of winter, the latter rains of March and April that filled out the grain, and then the long anxious weeks of ripening, watching the sky, watching the stalks, calculating the harvest against the debt owed to the landowner, against the portion owed to the temple, against the hunger of the previous season still sitting in the bones. Harvest was not celebration first. It was crisis management first. The window for harvesting wheat and barley was narrow, perhaps 3 to 4 weeks before the grain over-ripened, fell to the ground, or was damaged by the sirocco, the hot eastern wind that could sweep in from the desert and destroy a field in hours. Every able body worked during harvest. Children, elderly relatives, hired laborers, anyone who could be summoned. The days were long, the work was brutal under the full summer sun, and the stakes were existential. A failed harvest did not mean belt-tightening. It meant debt. It meant selling assets. In extreme cases, it meant selling children into labor or selling oneself. This is not background information. This is the lived texture of the world in which Jesus stood up and said, "Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They do not labor or spin." That sentence, spoken to an audience of farmers and farm laborers who had spent their entire lives in precisely that labor, was not a gentle nature observation. It was an extraordinary intervention. He was not telling them that work was unimportant. He was addressing the specific anxiety, the grinding, sleepless, bone-deep anxiety of people whose survival depended on variables entirely outside their control. The weather, the landlord, the tax collector, the worm in the grain. He was speaking to people who understood, viscerally, what it meant to watch the sky and fear what was coming. Taxes in first-century Judea were not a line item on a form. They were a physical presence at the edge of every field. The system of taxation under Roman occupation layered on top of the existing Jewish temple tax structure, created a burden that scholars estimate extracted between 30 and 40% of agricultural production from Galilean farming families in an average year. This was not an abstraction. This was a third of what your hands had grown, taken by systems over which you had no voice and against which you had no appeal. The Roman system operated through tax farmers, men who bid for the right to collect taxes in a given region and then extracted whatever they could above the official rate, keeping the surplus as profit. These were the tax collectors of the Gospels. They were not bureaucrats behind desks. They were men who appeared at the threshing floor, at the moment of harvest, when the grain was freshly separated from the chaff, and the year's work lay visible in a pile on the stone. They were men who knew exactly what a field had produced, who had informants and records, and who collected their portion with the authority of Rome standing behind them. To refuse was not a moral option. To negotiate was to lose more. Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector of Jericho who climbs a sycamore tree to see Jesus passing, was not a petty figure. He was a wealthy man in a city that controlled a major customs point, the road from Transjordan into the Roman province. He had grown rich on a system that impoverished his neighbors. And yet, he climbs a tree. The image is almost comic. A wealthy, powerful, short man scrambling up into the branches. But there is something in it that goes beyond comedy. It is a man who has placed himself above the crowd, above the social order, literally elevated by money, and yet desperately trying to see something he is afraid he will miss. Jesus does not address the crowd first. He looks up, into the tree, and calls him by name. For the people watching that scene, farmers, laborers, debtors, it was not a comfortable moment. It was a disruption. The teacher they had followed, the man who spoke of the kingdom, was inviting himself to dinner at the house of the man who had taken their grain. The marketplace was the nervous system of the village economy, and it operated on a logic that had almost nothing to do with money. This requires some unpacking, because the modern instinct is to imagine commerce as a relatively neutral transaction. You have something, I want it. We agree on a price. Exchange happens. In first-century Galilee, exchange was almost never neutral. It was embedded in a web of obligation, honor, debt, kinship, and social memory that stretched back generations. The man who sold you grain remembered that your grandfather had borrowed seed from his grandfather and repaid it late. The woman who traded olive oil with your mother knew exactly how much oil your family's trees had produced for the last 20 years. Nothing was anonymous. Nothing was forgotten. The marketplace was not just an economic space. It was a social theater in which the relative standing of every family in the village was continuously performed, evaluated, and recorded. Not in writing, but in the collective memory of the community. Credit existed, but it was not abstract. It was personal. When a farmer ran short after a bad harvest, he did not go to a bank. He went to a neighbor, a relative, a wealthier landowner in the village, or to a merchant in the nearest town. The loan was oral, witnessed, and carried an interest rate that could range from modest to crushing depending on the lender and the desperation of the borrower. Debt in that world was not a financial state. It was a social state. A debtor family was a family under obligation to another person, not to an institution. And that obligation was visible, daily, and inescapable. You saw your creditor at the synagogue. You passed him on the road. Your children played with his children. The debt was a thread woven into every interaction. This is why the parable of the unmerciful servant in Matthew 18 operates the way it does. A king forgives a servant an astronomical debt. 10,000 talents. A sum so absurd it was clearly meant to be understood as beyond calculation. beyond any realistic debt a person could accumulate. The servant then goes out and finds a fellow servant who owes him 100 denarii, a real amount, a significant amount, but a human amount. He seizes him. He demands repayment. He has him thrown in prison when the man cannot pay. The other servants, the text says, were greatly distressed. Of course they were, because in the world Jesus was describing, everyone in that room would have recognized the scene. They had all been both servants in that story at some point in their lives. They understood, from the inside, what it felt like to be seized by the throat over a debt. The parable was not an illustration of an abstract theological point about forgiveness. It was a story drawn directly from the street outside. Bread was not food. Bread was life itself, and the distinction matters. In the diet of a Galilean family, bread, specifically flatbread made from wheat or barley flour, provided the vast majority of daily caloric intake. Wheat was preferred and more expensive. Barley was the grain of the poor, denser, less palatable, but filling and available. A family that ate wheat bread regularly had enough. A family that had shifted to barley was already in difficulty. A family that had neither was in crisis. The process of making bread was daily, because the flatbreads of this period did not keep well. Ground in the morning, the dough was mixed with water and a small amount of sourdough starter, kept alive from the previous batch, carried forward like a living inheritance from one day to the next, then allowed to ferment slightly before being pressed flat and cooked on a convex iron griddle or on the stones beside the fire. The bread that emerged was dense, chewy, slightly sour, fragrant with heat, and sustaining in a way that was both physical and symbolic. To offer bread to a guest was not hospitality in the decorative sense. It was the fundamental act of inclusion. You are sharing my survival with me. To withhold bread was not rudeness. It was a statement about the relationship between two people. The entire discourse in John 6, in which Jesus declares himself the bread of life, operates inside this framework with a force that is almost impossible to translate into a culture of food abundance. He was not speaking of a dietary supplement. He was speaking of the thing that, when it runs out, means you will not survive. He was claiming to be that thing. The crowd that had followed him into the wilderness to hear him teach, the same crowd he had fed with 5 loaves and 2 fish the day before, began to grumble and drift away after this teaching. Not because it was spiritually difficult, because it was humanly incomprehensible. A man made of bread? A bread that does not run out? Their entire lives had been organized around the terror that the bread would run out. The synagogue was the architecture of communal life in a way that has no modern equivalent. In the first century, the synagogue was not primarily a building, especially in smaller villages, where a dedicated structure may not have existed at all. It was an institution, a gathering, an assembly of the adult men of the community for the purpose of reading Torah, hearing teaching, adjudicating disputes, organizing communal obligations, and maintaining the social and religious coherence of the village. In larger towns, dedicated synagogue buildings existed and have been excavated by archaeologists. Stone benches lining the interior walls, a central space for reading, oriented toward Jerusalem. In smaller communities, the assembly may have gathered in a large courtyard, a private home, or any space adequate to hold the community. The Sabbath assembly was not optional in the social sense. Absence was noticed. Absence communicated something about your relationship to the community, your status, your loyalty to the covenant that defined the group. For a family already on the margins, debtors, the sick, those with a member considered ritually impure, the synagogue was simultaneously the place where belonging was most powerfully expressed and the place where exclusion was most publicly enacted. A woman bent double for 18 years, whom Jesus healed on the Sabbath in the synagogue at Luke 13, was present in that assembly. She had not stopped coming. Despite everything, she was there. That detail is not incidental. It tells you something about her, and something about what the assembly meant even to those whom its strictest interpretations had failed. The ruler of the synagogue's indignation after the healing, "There are 6 days for work. Come on those days," was not simple cruelty. It was the response of a man whose entire social and religious identity was organized around the maintenance of a boundary. He was not a villain. He was a custodian, doing what custodians do. Jesus' answer cuts not at the man, but at the logic. You untie your ox on the Sabbath to lead it to water. Is this woman less than your ox? The crowd rejoiced. The custodian was put to shame. But the force of that moment only lands fully when you understand that in this world, an ox was not a simple animal. It was capital. It was the difference between a family that could plow and a family that could not. Jesus had just said, "I am placing this woman above your most valuable economic asset." In that world, that was a radical statement dressed in the plainest possible language. Death lived closer in first-century Judea than most modern minds are comfortable imagining. Not as a philosophical concept, not as a theological abstraction, as a neighbor, as a regular visitor to households that had done nothing wrong, made no particular error, suffered no unusual misfortune, just lived in a world where the distance between health and dying was measured in days, sometimes hours, and where the mechanisms that now stand between a person and death simply did not exist. There were no antibiotics. There was no surgical intervention for internal infection. There was no rehydration therapy for the diarrheal diseases that killed infants with terrifying efficiency. There was no reliable treatment for the fevers that swept through villages in the hot months, for the parasitic infections carried by contaminated water, for the complications of childbirth that took young women at the moment of giving life. Infant mortality in the ancient world is estimated by historians working from skeletal evidence and comparative demographic data at somewhere between 30 and 40% before the age of 5. That means in a village of 300 people in any given decade, a significant portion of the children born would not survive to begin working in the fields alongside their parents. Every family carried that weight. Every mother who had given birth had, in all likelihood, also buried. The grief was not exceptional. It was woven into the fabric of ordinary life, observed, mourned, absorbed, and carried forward, because there was no other option. This context does not make the raising of Lazarus a more impressive miracle. It was already the most dramatic miracle recorded in the Gospels. What it does is change the emotional register of the scene entirely. When Mary falls at Jesus' feet and says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died," she is not speaking from inside a cushioned, managed grief. She is speaking from inside the raw, unfiltered experience of a world where death was always close and always final, and always arrived before you were ready. The tomb had been sealed for 4 days. 4 days in a Palestinian summer meant the physical reality of death was not abstract. She knew what was in that tomb. Jesus knew. When the text says simply, "Jesus wept," that sentence has always carried enormous weight. In this world, it carries something more specific. He was not weeping at the fact of death in general. He was standing at the specific, irreversible edge of a specific loss, inside a culture that had no buffer between the living and the dead, and he wept. The road was not a background detail in the world of Jesus. It was a world unto itself. First-century Judea was cross-hatched with roads. Roman military roads paved with fitted stone. Regional trade routes, compacted by centuries of foot traffic and animal hooves. Local paths connecting villages to fields, to wells, to the nearest market town. These roads were not safe. They were not monitored. They passed through uninhabited stretches of hill and desert, where a traveler alone was genuinely vulnerable to robbery, to exposure, to simple misfortune, with no witness and no rescuer. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho, which descends roughly 1,000 meters in elevation over approximately 27 kilometers through barren, rocky, and intensely isolated terrain, was known specifically as a place where robbers operated. It was not a metaphor chosen for dramatic effect. It was a road that people traveled with fear, in groups when possible, in daylight when possible, with the prayer that nothing would go wrong. The parable of the Good Samaritan, set on that specific road, begins with a man going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Every person in Jesus' audience knew that road. Many of them had walked it. The ambush, the stripping, the leaving for dead. These were not hypothetical horrors. They were real risks on a real road. The priest who passes by on the other side, the Levite who does the same. These were not caricatures of indifference. They were men navigating a genuine tension. Contact with a corpse rendered a person ritually impure and unable to perform temple duties. If the man on the road was already dead, touching him had consequences. If he was dying, helping him meant stopping on a road where the robbers might still be present. The priest and the Levite made choices that were, within the logic of their world, defensible. That is precisely what makes Jesus' story so sharp. He was not asking his audience to condemn obvious monsters. He was asking them to look at defensible choices and ask whether defensible was the same as right. The Samaritan stopped, and the Samaritan's stopping cost him something real: oil, wine, the use of his animal, money paid to the innkeeper, a promise to return and pay whatever additional cost had accumulated. These were not symbolic gestures. They were material expenditures by a man who had no social obligation to the wounded stranger, who belonged to a group considered by the wounded man's own community to be hereditary enemies, and who stopped anyway. Jesus then asked, "Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" The lawyer who had asked the original question, and who had almost certainly expected a theological answer, said, "The one who showed mercy." He could not even bring himself to say the Samaritan. Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." The temple stood at the center of the Jewish world in a way that cannot be overstated. Herod the Great had begun an enormous expansion of the Temple Mount in approximately 20 BCE, a construction project so ambitious that it was still ongoing decades later. The Gospel of John records that the temple had been under construction for 46 years when Jesus was present in Jerusalem. The result was one of the most impressive architectural complexes in the ancient world. The retaining walls of the Temple Mount were built from massive limestone blocks, some weighing hundreds of tons, cut from quarries and fitted together without mortar with extraordinary precision. The stones were dressed with flat margins and a slightly raised central boss, a style recognizable still today in the lower courses of the Western Wall in Jerusalem. The temple was not only a religious site, it was an economic engine, a banking center, a pilgrimage destination that drew Jewish families from across Judea, Galilee, and the diaspora, from Egypt, from Babylon, from Rome itself, 3 times a year for the major festivals. The population of Jerusalem during Passover swelled from its ordinary size to something many times larger, with pilgrims camping on hillsides, in courtyards, in every available space outside the city walls. The economy of Jerusalem was built substantially around the temple, and its pilgrimage traffic, The money changers who converted foreign currency into the Tyrian shekel required for the temple tax. The merchants who sold sacrificial animals to pilgrims who had traveled too far to bring their own. The priestly families who administered the vast institutional machinery of sacrifice, purification, and festival. When Jesus entered the temple courts and overturned the tables of the money changers, he was not performing a quiet symbolic gesture. He was physically disrupting the infrastructure of one of the most economically significant institutions in the Eastern Mediterranean. The money changers were not operating illegally. They were providing a necessary service within a system that required their presence. The animal sellers were not profiteers in any simple sense. They enabled poor pilgrims to fulfill their religious obligations without the nearly impossible burden of transporting live animals from distant regions. The disruption Jesus created was brief, contained, and quickly restored. What it communicated, however, landed with the force of thunder. He was standing in his Father's house and announcing that something had gone wrong with the way the house was being run. The chief priests and the scribes heard it. They began looking for a way to destroy him. And then came the week that changed the count of time itself. The Passover of that year, the year the Gospels placed the final entry into Jerusalem, the arrest in the garden, the trials before the high priest and before Pilate, the execution and the empty tomb, unfolded inside this same world. The same dust, the same limestone walls, the same olive oil lamps burning low in the darkness, the same bread being ground by women before dawn in households all across the city. The disciples who sat with Jesus in the upper room the night before his arrest were not men who had been removed from ordinary life by their association with him. They were men of that world, in that world, smelling of that world, of road dust and fish and smoke, and the particular smell of a Jerusalem crowded with Passover pilgrims. The bread he broke at that table was the same bread that had been ground and baked in 1,000 kitchens across the city that day. The wine he poured had come from the same vines, pressed in the same wine presses, stored in the same clay jars that filled the cellars of Galilean farms. When he said, "This is my body, this is my blood," he was not reaching for exotic symbols from a foreign vocabulary. He was holding the most ordinary things in the world, the most daily, the most essential, the things without which life simply stopped. And he was saying, "This is what I am for you." That is what this world makes clear. Not a distant God descending into human theater to perform a transaction. A man who had grown up grinding grain, who had slept on packed earth, who had walked those roads and drunk from those cisterns and sat in those synagogues and mourned at those tombs, and who, at the end, took the bread and the wine that were the substance of ordinary survival and offered them as the substance of something that did not end. The women who came to the tomb on the first day of the week came before dawn. They came at the hour of the millstone, the hour of the grinding, the hour when every ordinary day began. They came to complete a burial rite that the Sabbath had interrupted, a practical task, a final act of care for a body they believed was simply dead. What they found instead became the hinge of history. They had come to tend to the dead. They left as witnesses to something the world had no category for yet. And the ordinary day, in all its dust and weight and smell and texture, was never quite ordinary again.